Does wet aging your brisket make it more tender and tasty? I wet aged a brisket for 4 months to find out, so let's get smoking. Welcome to the Smoke Lab. My name's Steve Gow, and on this show I do crazy barbecue experiments you would never do at home so you can learn from my trial and error. Wet aging, what is it? Well, believe it or not, you've already been wet aging your briskets because they start wet aging the day they're sealed in their cryovac bags. According to Lowry's Meat Science, the tenderness of meat is improved by wet aging due to proteolytic, lysosomal, and other tenderizing reactions. And wet aging also affects the flavor of meat. Daniel Vaughn of Texas Monthly wet aged a brisket for a full year and described the brisket as kind of livery, sour, bitter, and serumy, which means that it tastes like raw blood for all of you non-vampires out there who don't know what that tastes like. Anyway, those flavors sound really gross, but he wet aged a brisket for a year, which is absolutely crazy. And he also says in his article that Aaron Franklin wet ages all the briskets at Franklin Barbecue from around 14 to 40 days. So there must be something to it if Aaron Franklin's doing it. And from my understanding, reading stuff on the internet about other people's experience with wet aged beef is that wet aged beef tends to be more tender and just a little bit acidic. So that sounds pretty good to me. Let's test it, starting with a brisket that I wet aged for 4 months. All right, let's see what we got here. This brisket looks pretty decent. It has some weird bubbles bubbling up from the inside, which have me a little bit concerned. You can see that there's a lot of liquid that's pooling around here, but otherwise it looks okay. Maybe it's a little bit grayer than normal. It looks pretty good though. Yeah, over here, a couple more bubbles than I would normally see. But otherwise, it looks pretty good. Let us crack into this guy and give it a whiff and see if I immediately vomit on camera. Just wafting it into my nose. It's actually pretty much normal. I've smelt a lot of fresh briskets that smell exactly like this. Actually, as I get deeper in there, there is a lot more funkiness. So I don't know, it's not like to the level that I wouldn't eat it, but it would give me pause. It's got a lot more liquid in it than I'm used to, so that's interesting. And it is a little bit funky. I have experimented in the past where I have kind of cooked brisket at like 100 degrees Fahrenheit for 24 hours, well below the food safe minimum, just to see what would happen. And that one stunk. That one was terrible. But this one has some of the same kind of sense to it. So that tells me that there's something funky going on here. But is it edible? I mean, I wouldn't throw it out. I would not throw it out. Okay, let's trim this guy up and season it. To trim the wet aged brisket, I just sliced down both sides and trimmed the fat cap down. I wanted to leave the fat cap a little bit thicker on this one so I could see if there was any change in flavor of the fat from all of the wet aging that I did. Then I flipped it over and I didn't do very much to the bottom. I used to trim off all the fat and silver skin, but I found the silver skin actually renders down just fine the way I cook it, and leaving all that extra fat on increases the juiciness and the moisture retention. You can see this brisket looks pretty good. It doesn't look rotten or really discolored or anything, and that really depends on how clean it was to start with. If the packer did a really good job and the brisket's clean when it went into the cryovac bag, it could stay fresh for a year like we saw with the Daniel Vaughn article. But if it's not super clean and it has some less desirable bacteria on it, then it could last for just a month. Signs of spoilage include mold, green discoloration, puffing up of the bag, and if you open the bag and it makes you gag instantly, then you know that you probably shouldn't eat it. But anecdotally, I found that if a brisket is fully sealed and there's no pinpricks or anything in it, it should last easily at least 2 months without any sort of spoilage. But if there's any sort of air in it or any pinpricks in the bag, I found that it won't even last 2 weeks in most cases. So the ideal situation for extended wet aging is that the cryovac bag is fully sealed and it was very clean when it got into the cryovac bag. Unfortunately, there's no real good way of doing that. You just have to buy briskets from reputable meat packers and hope that they're clean. After trimming the wet aged brisket, I trimmed the fresh control brisket and then moved on to seasoning them. For the rub, I'm using Smoke Trail's BBQ brisket rub. I like to go on pretty heavy with this stuff. Then I'm doing a second layer of Oklahoma Joe's Nashville hot rub and repeating that on top of each brisket as well. After 30 minutes on the counter, I'm placing both briskets on the top rack of my Tahoma. I thought they'd be okay with pans underneath, but I kind of chickened out later and added some pans to catch the drippings because I was afraid that having those briskets on during this overnight cook, it would overfill the drip pan and I'd have some spillage issues. I'm now filling up the Tahoma Tahoma with a few Oklahoma Joe's charcoal briquettes, then alternating wood chunks and briquettes until it's full. Then I'm placing some tumbleweed starters in the ashtray and lighting up the charcoal, and after that I just set it to 225 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's gonna smoke away at that temperature overnight for approximately 9 hours. The next morning, the briskets look like this, briskety and beautiful. They were temping at around 165 to 170, so I decided to wrap them up in some foil with clarified butter. Then I put them in my holding oven at 300 degrees Fahrenheit. You could also just use your regular oven for this, or just keep going on the Tahoma. It's up to you. I just find that meat tends to cook a little bit more evenly in the oven after I've wrapped it. And after the briskets both probe tender at around 203 to 207 degrees internal, I removed them, let them rest for 2 hours, and then I got ready for the taste test. Guys, I am excited about this. This is the experimental brisket on my right, your left. This is the one that I wet aged for 4 months in my fridge. And this is the control brisket on my left, your right. I'm just gonna start by smelling the briskets. I'll smell the control brisket first. It smells smoky, but otherwise it just smells really good and smoky and neutral. So let's smell the wet aged brisket now. It definitely smells different. It smells smoky and it smells similar to what this one smells like, but it also has a funkiness to it. It reminds me of my childhood when I used to have a pet iguana, and smelling its cage, it was kind of like this musty, humid type smell in there. So it kind of smells like an old lizard cage, to be honest. But hopefully it tastes better than it smells. Let's move this one to the side here, and I'll cut into the control brisket so you guys can take a look at it. I'll just make a slice right down the middle. It's slicing like a dream. I think this one's gonna be pretty good. I'll give you guys a look. Nice and juicy, gotta love that. Take a slice of the flat, well, predominantly flat. There's a lot of the point kind of stacked on top of the flat here, but it's okay. That was a pretty thin slice, but oh well. We'll put that to the side and I'll do another one. It's really hard to slice when I'm trying to show you guys here. Usually I have it facing perpendicular to me. All right, there we go. So I'll give you guys a look. We'll pull that apart, pulls apart like a dream. It's a beautiful brisket. It's juicy, it's salty, it's well seasoned, it has a lot of smoke flavor. I'll taste a little bit of the fat. The fat's decently rendered. I got no complaints about this brisket. I'll put this to the side here. Let's get a slice of the flat here. So I'll slice off the burnt ends, and I'll just take the very end. It looks really beautiful. Look at that. Really nice point slice. The fat cap is rendered all the way down. Absolutely beautiful. That's my favorite bite in barbecue. Delicious. So I really honestly have nothing bad to say about this brisket. Let's see what the wet aged brisket tastes like. Will this be the last Smoke Trails video because I die from eating this brisket? We'll find out soon, folks. So we'll slice this right down the middle, just like the last one. It seems less juicy. Seems like there's less moisture in this brisket. I'll give you guys a look. Interesting. Yeah, okay. I mean, it looks pretty normal. It just smells, you know what? It smells like lactic acid. I have some pure lactic acid. Don't ask me why. Actually, it's just for like barbecue experiments and stuff. And it smells kind of like that. So that doesn't actually surprise me that much, actually. I think a lot of the bacteria on the meat produces lactic acid as a byproduct. Yeah, it's very, very lactic acidy smelling. Okay, let's slice into the flat here. It seems drier. It seems like there's just less moisture in general in this brisket. The slice looks a little different. We'll pull it apart. I mean, oh, whoa, 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 whoa. This thing is tender, guys. Okay, I'm a little bit apprehensive, but gotta do it for science. Here goes nothing. Okay, I didn't want to immediately spit it out. It does taste very different than the last brisket. I don't really know how to describe that flavor. The best way that I could describe it, I'm trying to think of Daniel Vaughn's article. He said it tasted livery and serum-y, like I guess that is supposed to be like blood or raw meat. It doesn't taste like that. I've never had raw blood before, but it doesn't taste like liver or raw meat or blood or anything like that. What it does taste like, and this bears a little bit of explanation. Years ago, I did an experiment where I brined brisket in different concentrations and different varieties of acids to see if I could get the brisket to be more tender. And this tastes most like the briskets that I brined in the lactic acid, in probably the lower concentration version of lactic acid that I brine a brisket with. Tastes very similar to that. So I think what's happening here is that the bacteria that is wet aging this brisket is producing lactic acid, and that's breaking down and denaturing the proteins, and also adding a sort of acidic lactic acid type flavor to it. Let's take a slice of the point now. So I'll slice the burnt ends off. It's really interesting consistency. It's almost like marshmallowy a little bit. There's less moisture in it. And that makes sense because there was so much liquid in that cryovac bag when I opened it. So let's pull this apart. I mean, it pulls apart effortlessly. Let's see what the seam fat tastes like in between the point and the flat. It's actually quite good. It has a different consistency. It's more like marshmallowy almost. It's pillowy, marshmallowy in texture, but it's also more acidic, tastes more acidic. And I'm getting a lot of that lactic acid flavor. The fat cap tastes almost mushroomy, earthy, very mushroomy, but also moving a little bit too far into almost like the musty type flavor territory. So I like a lot of the notes that I'm picking up on, like the mushroomy flavored fat cap, very mushroomy, earthy. The inside consistency is very pillowy, marshmallowy, very different than any other brisket I've tried before in terms of consistency. And it has a more acidic lactic acid type note on the side of the tongue. But I think I wet aged this brisket a little bit too long, and it's developing some more musty type flavors that I don't really prefer. So I'd probably prefer the control brisket, just the regular brisket that wasn't wet aged at all. But it would be really interesting to see what a wet aged brisket tastes like that's maybe been wet aged only for maybe 2 months or a month and a half, to see if you get some of those mushroomy type notes on the fat, earthy mushroomy type notes, and the acidic flavor without going into the realm of that musty scent that I referred to earlier that kind of smelled like an old lizard cage. Yeah, now that I think about it, musty, lactic acidy, earthy, mushroomy, those are all the scents and the flavors that I'm picking up on for sure. But it's just a little bit too much. So it definitely changes the flavor of the brisket. Does it increase the tenderness? Well, this is really hard to pick up on because when you cook a brisket, you're really cooking it to probe tenderness anyway. So even if you're taking a really tough brisket, you're cooking it to a place where it's gonna be really super tender anyway. So even if this meat was ultra tender because of the aging process, I don't think I'd be able to pick up on that as much because they were both taken to really the same probe tenderness texture. The one thing I would say is that it did change the texture of the wet aged brisket. It is more marshmallowy and pillowy, and there's less moisture in between the muscle fibers, but it's still pretty good. And I like the texture and I like the different flavor notes. I think that would I wet age a brisket in the future? I probably would try it again, but I'd only wet age it for maybe a month and a half or 2 months to see if I can get some of those additional flavor notes, some of that additional pillowy, marshmallowy type texture in the middle of the meat, but not go too far into the realm of too earthy and musty and lactic acidy like I did with this brisket. So thanks so much for watching, guys. If you have any other ideas for future experiments on the Smoke Lab, let me know in the description section below. Don't forget to subscribe to the Oklahoma Joe's YouTube channel, and until next time, happy smoking.